Driving the incredibly fast Formula 1 cars in F1 24 with a racing wheel is undoubtedly one of the most immersive ways to hit the track in this year's game. You can play F1 24 with a controller and have a really enjoyable time, but adding a racing wheel and pedal to the mix can really boost the immersion and realism. Now F1 24 does have a range of presets for some of the more popular racing wheels, but not all wheels have their own preset configuration, and many of those presets aren't the best and can be improved on. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up any racing wheel in F1 24. I'll also show the wheel settings, including calibration and force feedback settings, and recommend some changes to make to ensure your racing wheel feels its best on track. Now, no matter which racing wheel you have, whether you have a Logitech wheel, Fanatec, Thrustmaster, Simucube, it doesn't matter. The first step is always to set it up and to make sure it is set up correctly. As long as the racing wheel you have is compatible with F1 24 and it's connected correctly to your Xbox, PlayStation or PC, the setup process should be fairly straightforward. The main thing to do if you're facing any issues is to ensure your racing wheel and pedals are both connected to your PC or console, powered up and working. If you're racing F1 24 on a PC, make sure you download any software for your racing wheel. Make sure that software is open and running in the background. Also, you may need to check for firmware updates or software updates which enable F1 24 with your racing wheel. This is something you don't need to do if you're racing on an Xbox or PlayStation, but if you're facing any issues at all or your racing wheel just feels a little bit off in F1 24, maybe try plugging it into a PC and just downloading and updating the firmware, see if that fixes anything. Now when you first boot up F1 24 with a racing wheel connected, you'll either have to choose your racing wheel as your primary input, or if the racing wheel you're using doesn't have a preset, you'll be required to create your own controller input. This requires going through the button mapping and mapping things like your throttle, your steering, gear selection, all of that sort of really important stuff, and then creating your own custom preset. Just go down through the button mapping list, select the input you want to change with either the A button or whichever button on your steering wheel actually kind of is the confirm button, and then just push your input or turn your steering wheel, whichever thing you're trying to set up at that time. One thing just to be aware of when you're creating your button mapping or your own custom preset is to be careful of clashes between different inputs. So for example, you don't want to be selecting an input to say open your DRS, which is actually the same input as changing gear up, because if you pull that in game, both those things will happen at the same time. Now, once you've chosen the preset for your racing wheel, or if you've created your own one for say a Simucube or Acertech, something that's not directly registered or recognized in F1 24, the next thing to do is head over to the calibration settings. These are some of the most important settings you can change within F1 24 if you're using a racing wheel, because they can ensure your wheel is working correctly and fix some input issues if it's not. Now, the first thing to do in the calibration settings is to perform a button test. When you press this button, 3 bars will come on screen, and these show you your steering, your throttle and your brake input. When you're not touching anything and your steering wheel is perfectly centered, these should all be at 0. Then when you fully depress your brake, your throttle and fully rotate your steering wheel, these should change to 100. If you can't hit 100% input, you'll need to calibrate your wheels and pedals either via your wheel software or adjust some of the F1 24 settings such as the saturation and dead zone in the calibration menu. One of the most common problems is that the game is registering some input when you're not actually pressing anything. Now, to fix this, you can increase your dead zone for whichever input is causing this issue. It's very important to make sure that each input is reading 0, because if you have some brake input being registered in game when you're not braking, this can force the DRS to close. And the same with steering. If there's some steering input being registered, your car can kind of drift across the track. So I'd recommend going into the dead zone for whichever setting and just kind of boosting it up a little bit, then perform another button test, see if you're now registering 0, if you're not, boost it a little bit more, and kind of just repeat this step until all 3 settings are reading as 0 when you're not doing anything. The saturation setting kind of does the opposite to your dead zone. If you cannot hit 100% input, no matter how hard you press your throttle or how far you press your brake pedal, then increasing the saturation will kind of make this a little bit easier. Essentially, it's kind of like an outside dead zone sort of setting. It kind of just reduces the amount of input you need to apply to hit 100% in-game input. This can be especially useful if you're using a load cell brake pedal, for example, because some of those can be really stiff, or sometimes your pressure isn't quite set right and you need to apply a lot of pressure to hit 100% input. Instead, just kind of increase your saturation for your brake pedal, and this will lower the amount of force you need to apply to the brake to be able to reach full brake pressure. Aside from the dead zone and saturation, there are two additional settings worth looking at in calibration. These are the linearity, which is available for each input, and the steering rate. Now the linearity adjusts your input curve for your steering, your throttle and your brakes. By default, F124 will be registering a linear input, which means if you apply 30% throttle, in theory the game should apply 30% throttle as well. Increasing the linearity will adjust this curve into a logarithmic curve to give you more control at the start of the pedal travel and steering input. For example, you can increase the linearity to result in you pressing the pedal physically 30% and only 20% input being registered in game. Now I wouldn't suggest going crazy with this setting, as it kind of makes things feel a little bit out of sorts, but it can be useful to gain a little bit more precision over some inputs. Now the steering rate can be seen as a sensitivity setting, but it's mainly designed for controller players, so if you're using a racing wheel, just leave this at default. Now with your racing wheel set up, calibrated and working correctly in game, you can then look to change your force feedback settings. When racing with a wheel, this set of settings can really let you configure how the force feedback feels on and off the track. All racing wheels will feel different when you first start racing in F124. A more powerful direct drive wheel will highlight different sensations that other wheels may not. Even two wheels producing similar amounts of power, such as the Logitech G923 and Thrustmaster T248, can feel incredibly different just because of the technology used in both wheels. This wheel-to-wheel difference in force feedback means there isn't a perfect single set of force feedback settings that you can use across every single wheel. Instead, each racing wheel works best with different force feedback settings. Now I'm going to run through each force feedback setting in F124 so you kind of know what to adjust and how it affects the feedback you actually feel. But I'll leave our recommended settings for a variety of the most popular racing wheels in the description below. So if you have a Moser R12 for example, I'll have settings for that exact wheel in the description. Now F124 doesn't include the highest amount of force feedback settings to tweak, however the ones it does let us change kind of affect some key areas. The strength setting changes the overall intensity of the feedback, while the on-track, the rumble strip and the off-track effects all affect the strength of force feedback when you're driving on different surfaces. The wheel damper setting is actually one of the more important settings, as this can directly change how your wheel feels. The setting is designed to simulate friction through your tyres, and increasing this will make your wheel feel a bit heavier. Lowering it will do the opposite and lighten your wheel. Now it's important you do keep some damping in your steering wheel, although you certainly don't want too much to the point where your wheel feels heavy or sticky to turn. The wheel rotation setting lets you change the maximum steering lock. This should normally be kept at or close to 400 degrees, as this feels pretty good with the new F124 handling model. But you can make some small adjustments up or down to kind of affect the overall sensitivity of your inputs. Now I've kind of run through every part of setting up a racing wheel in F124, I'd recommend go ahead and looking at our recommended force feedback settings for the wheel you have. Like I said, I've got links in the description below for each individual video. With just a little bit of adjustment, you can really drastically improve your experience when racing F124 with a wheel. Now if you've liked this video, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments below which racing wheel you're using and whether you have a recommended set of settings. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm going to be releasing a ton of F124 content across the coming days and weeks and months. From car setups to other sorts of guides, advanced technique guides, that sort of thing. So if you want to be notified when those videos drop, hit that subscribe button and also hit that alert bell. I'll be dropping new videos pretty much every single day, so keep an eye out for those. But for now guys, enjoy racing with a wheel and I will see you on track.